at the beginning of the 20th century, there was something called the early 20th century warming. So until recently, it was the fastest warming global temperature period according to the observational records. But it was always a bit strange. The land temperatures were warmer than the ocean, were relatively warmer than the ocean temperatures.
Welcome back to the National Oceanography Centre's Into the Blue podcast, where we talk to the people leading the way in raising the profile of the ocean through research, exploration and advocacy. We hope you enjoy today's episode. Hello, I'm Dr. Zoe Jacobs, and today I'm joined by Dr. Elizabeth Kent to learn about how a recent study helped understand an apparent cold feature in sea surface temperature data that's been puzzling ocean experts for decades. So welcome, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before starting, I just wanted to say congratulations are in order. You were recently awarded an MBE. That's really exciting.
Yes, it was completely unexpected, and yes, and obviously a great honour. So,
yes, absolutely.
And it's and it recognises the work that I've been doing here over decades,
yes.
And that's what we're going to talk about today.
Amazing, exactly. So on that, can you tell us a bit more about your role at NOC and what your main areas of research are?
So I've been here at NOC for a very long time. I started in the early 90s, and originally I was recruited to look at observations relevant for air-sea interactions, so looking at air and sea temperatures and wind speeds, and trying to use those to get estimates of how the atmosphere and ocean exchange heat. Now those calculations are very sensitive to errors in the data, which is really how I got on to doing what I do most of the time now, which is looking at the really long records we have, mainly of temperatures, but also of other variables over the ocean, and really trying to understand how we can relate an observation we made hundreds of years ago to one that we made yesterday. Yeah.
And you just kind of touched on this next question I had, but so how long have scientists and researchers been taking measurements of sea surface temperature for?
Well, observations have been made for hundreds of years. I mean, one of the first people to actually make measurements of the sea temperature over the ocean was Benjamin Franklin, who in the 1780s made a few measurements of the ocean surface temperature. And I think he just tied a rope round a thermometer and dangled it over the side of the ship while he was on a voyage. So, those sorts of measurements are kind of interesting for us, but we actually need a few more to actually try and generate fields that tell us something about global temperatures rather than just a local temperature. So I guess temperatures started being made systematically a bit later than that. Actually, air temperatures were measured before sea surface temperatures. So one of the first sources we have of temperature measurements sort of made systematically over the ocean were from the East India Company ships. So they were plying their trade around the world, and we have it means we have quite good records of air temperature measurements. But it took till about the 1850s where sea temperature started to be measured systematically, and the Americans sort of got the world organised to measure systematically. So they developed what they called abstract logs, so that the measurements were taken in similar ways and recorded, and that's really that's why we start to see global surface temperature data sets starting in the 1850s, because that's really when we start to get measurements from enough of the world to be able to start saying something about global temperatures.
Yeah, and I guess the methods used to measure these temperatures are probably slightly different from the thermometer dangling over the side of the ship.
Well, yes. So we started off. So buckets feature quite prominently in this. So the next stage was to just throw a bucket over the side, haul it up, leave it on deck, and then take a measurement of the temperature with a standard thermometer. So what you then start worrying about is exactly how they did that, and the sorts of buckets they used, and how long they took, and all of those things turn out to be noticeable in the observations we have today. So we can actually look at the observations we are measuring, and we can read the instructions that they were given, and we can understand how that has actually affected the measurements that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. And you recently contributed to a really interesting study that showed that measurements of sea surface temperatures made at the beginning of the, I think, 20th century, was it, were actually too cold. So can you tell us a bit more about that study?
Well, this is exactly what I was just talking about. So there's at the beginning of the 20th century, there was something called the early 20th century warming. Mm-hmm. So until recently, it was the fastest warming global temperature period according to the observational records. But it was always a bit strange. The land temperatures were warmer than the ocean, were relatively warmer than the ocean temperatures. So we think about anomalies. So we take what we call a climatology. So we have a period where we say we're going to use that as our reference period, and typically now we use the period 1981 to 2010, and so everything is referenced to the typical conditions in that period. So now the temperatures are much warmer, and historically they were colder than that. But in the early 20th century, the ocean was very much colder. The anomalies for the ocean were very much colder than they were over the land, and this was really hard to understand. Every other type of data that we looked at, so models didn't show this. This is really important. If the models, if we're seeing things happening in the world that the models aren't capturing, that's really uncomfortable, because we're using these to predict how we need to respond to increasing temperatures. So it turns out that the models were actually doing a better job than the observations in this case. So
not heard that before.
And what my contribution to this study was, so Professor Sebastian Sippel from Leipzig University put together a team of people, and they looked at paleo data, and they looked at model output, and they looked at lots of different observational data sets, and it kept coming out with this uncomfortable for me fact that the sea temperatures were colder than could be explained by any of the other data sources. So he came to me because I'm known for being interested in this sort of thing. And we looked at the observations in detail, and the observations in this period are a bit they're not our best observations. They actually come from punch cards. So they were collected from logbooks, they were then put onto punch cards, and then the data that we have in the 60s were transferred from punch cards onto tapes. And in that period, a lot of the useful information that we would like, doing that long process of taking the data as originally recorded and then putting it into various digital forms that were what people used at the time, means that we lost what we call metadata. So we lost information about how the observations were taken, and one of the most important things was the ships. So we basically just have observations of several variables, but just the time, the location and the time, and we don't have the information on the ships, which makes it hard to understand these important differences that we're looking at. For example, what sort of buckets did they use, because that was defined by country, because these ships were recruited by different countries and they were given different instructions. So what I managed to do was to look at, it was quite complicated, but probably nobody but me is very interested in it. But I managed to work out that there's one of these data sources that we didn't really know very much about actually came from American ships. And what I also have in my office is instructions on how the observations were taken by American ships in this period. And the instructions told them to leave the buckets on board on the deck for 3 minutes before making the measurement. So, and the reason for this is that old thermometers were a bit chunky, and they then took longer to respond. So the idea was that you put it in and you waited till it reached equilibrium with the temperature of the water in the bucket, which is important. But obviously during that time, because the sea is warmer than the air, the water was cooling by evaporation. So what we could actually do is look at the different issues of the instructions, and we could see that they changed over time because they recognised this was a problem. So if you look at the different issues of the instructions, it says 3 minutes, and then it says 1 minute, and then it says do it as quickly as you can. And you can actually look at the observations and see that they become less cold over time from this particular subset of the data, which we now know came from American ships. So it's all a bit detailed, but it just shows that, you know, we need all of this information. So, you know, it's what we call the grey literature. It's not, you know, now, you know, if you write a scientific study, it gets a digital object identifier, and, you know, we have an expectation that in 100 years' time somebody could find your last piece of work. But you know, in the past, and also because the instructions changed, people were told to throw them away. So, you know, we're lucky we've actually got any of these things, because people, you know, thought, oh, you know, that's how we used to do it. We don't, you know, we've updated our methods. But, you know, so what I'm trying to do is to gather as much of that information as we can, so we can actually look at the observations. And that means that we can look at observations taken in the early 20th century and try and make sure that we understand how they relate to observations we take right now. So obviously, if we're looking at temperature differences, then obviously the historical record is the first part of that.
Amazing. So basically, we're really lucky that you had these historical instructions sat in your office.
Well, it's not just me. So, you know, there's a lot of people who have recognised this, and there's been, you know, efforts to digitise these, you know, so sometimes we have, you know, paper records and sometimes we have digital records, but we still don't really have a very good system to systematically store this stuff, because, you know, Sebastian came to me because he knew that I had all this sort of information. So what we really need is to make sure that this information, you know, gets out there and in a way that you know, other people can use, rather than having to come to me every time they need to know about some artifact in the historical data. So that's the next next goal, is to try and make all this stuff more accessible to everybody. And, you know, that will mean that people can, you know, other people can start looking at these sorts of things, and you know, because there's a lot of features in the data that we'd really like to understand. And it'd be great to start, you know, if people, you know, we're always talking about artificial intelligence, and it'd be really great if we can start digging into these observations and try and understand them a bit better. But you know, there's no point for people doing that and just going, oh well, you know, that's, you know, and finding out all these information that's just been lost because we didn't store it properly.
No, of course. And was the this different method, or so you were saying that it was the American ships that used this kind of different method. Was it kind of a global, I don't know if is the right problem that we have this kind of, or was it kind of concentrated around America, for example, or was this kind of cold anomaly happening everywhere, or is that something that you guys want to investigate a bit more? We've identified it, but we haven't fixed it yet. I mean, one of the problems that I was talking about is that we don't actually have individual, we don't have information on the individual ships that made the observation. So the first step is to actually is to try and to split the data up into tracks. So we've been doing some what we call ship tracking. So just you know, trying to find voyages amongst all of the data, which sounds kind of easy, but one of the problems is that they rounded all the positions. So you know, you kind of you know, even just working out what direction the ship's going in is you know, and there's gaps, and you know, ships just stopped, you know, they lost some data. I mean, sometimes in the old records you see just like an empty square, and that'll be where the data was put on a tape, and then the tape got lost, you know. So it's because, you know, people, I mean, when I on my first day in my job, I was handed a 9-track tape and told that I needed to read this, and you know, and they're a bit flaky tapes, you know, they have to be carefully looked after, and you know, they're bulky, and you know, a lot of the work generating old data sets was carrying tapes around, and before that punch cards, and before that logbooks. So we're really lucky now that we have all these observations in digital form, and we can just
we can just take a look. But
Yeah.
before it was, and you look at the data and you go, oh, how did they not notice that square
Yeah.
where there's no data? But
Yeah.
that was just, it was so hard to do
Yeah, of course,
anything.
yeah.
We take it for granted that all
Yeah.
the data's sitting there in the on our computers
Yeah,
and just
absolutely.
waiting for us to be used.
Yeah.
But, that certainly wasn't the case for a long time, and we're now able to quickly spot things that people couldn't before.
Yeah.
They stored everything by region because that's usually what you wanted to do, was look
Yeah,
at
of course.
rather than having all the data on a tape for the whole world.
Yeah.
You'd have a square on a tape, and then if you so you never actually looked at that global map until you got to right to the end of the process.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yes, but it's so and the decisions we make today about what we keep, what we throw away, how we document everything. The you and me in the future are going to be complaining
exactly. So the real question for me then is, what does this discovery mean for sea surface temperatures now? I mean, it's obviously very interesting, but I guess what I'm asking is, why do we care about something from the past?
So one reason we care about it is for policy. So the Paris Climate Agreement says that we want to try and limit changes in global surface temperature to 1.5 degrees, although that seems very unlikely to be possible, or 2 degrees. But the message is as small a change as possible. So while we're the early 20th century, so we're looking at differences from the reference period is 1850 to 1900. So on one level, you might say, okay, well, that doesn't matter that the early 20th century is a bit cold because we're actually just looking at differences from this pre-industrial level. But as I said earlier, if the climate models aren't working, it's how we get there is important for understanding how our projections for the future are going to work. So the better data sets we can generate to and we look, I've been talking about global surface temperature. You tried to get me to talk about regional differences, and we do see one thing that's interesting is because the way that things are measured are country based. Obviously ships from different countries tend to be in different regions. So some of the so my colleague Duo Chan in the now at Southampton University looked at observations in the Atlantic and the Pacific where the trends were different, and then associated that. And that was actually due again to punch cards, and when the Japanese data had been digitized, instead of they just dropped the digits, so they ended up being cold. So rather than rounding the data, there was a systematic truncation. So we can start picking out these things in the data, and again, using statistical or in the future machine learning or AI techniques, we should be able to really understand the differences in this data and then relate them back to. So that wasn't answering your question, was it?
Well, not on a slight tangent, but we like that. That's fine.
So thinking about obviously. So the Paris Climate Agreement and temperature change. Obviously, if we make adjustments to understand the early data better, that actually changes our picture of how temperatures have changed. Now that doesn't suddenly mean if we reduced the apparent temperature change, then everything's fine, because we're really looking at impacts for that. So the global temperature is a sort of handy summary of how the changes we're making by putting extra greenhouse gases into the atmosphere are affecting the global climate. So we don't really care that the temperature's gone up by a fraction of a degree. We care about the impact that has on our weather, climate, sea level, melting ice, and all that sort of thing. So it seems a bit esoteric, but it's the better records we have of how climate has changed in the past one of the things we're interested in is the effects of volcanoes. So while we have a few examples of volcanic eruptions and how that's changed surface temperature and climate since we've had, for example, the modern observing system with satellites and drifting buoys, there are examples of larger volcanoes in the past that we'd like to understand, and we're really trying to get our temperature records good enough that we can understand the impact those have had on the atmosphere and the climate, and then if we can really start challenging the climate models and saying, well, do they actually reproduce these effects?
Really interesting. So I guess you figured out that there is a cold anomaly, well, not a cold anomaly, but
it's a cold bias.
Yeah, it's probably better way to say it. Is the next step trying to fix that?
Yes. So this is a bigger task. I mean, it's easy to...
It sounds like a monster of a task.
Yes. So, I mean, basically, we need to really go back and sort of reprocess the whole data set, which is a massive task.
I was going to say.
So that's basically what we're trying to do at the moment, is go back and really... So the first thing is really to get this ship tracking cracked. And as soon as we can start pulling out the different voyages from individual ships, we can start looking to see whether we can pick out the individual biases that we see in individual ships, because if this is correct, and it looks like it is, that we should be able to look at the American ships and look at the statistics of how their temperatures vary, and see those are different from things like ships from the UK or the Netherlands or Germany, which we know took slightly different approaches to measurements.
Cool. Well, good luck with that. And I guess once you have hopefully managed to kind of fix that as best you can, I mean, what will that data then be used to do? I guess will it go into the climate models to kind of improve those possibly, or?
Yes. So I mean, one thing that is increasingly shown to be important is something we call structural uncertainty. So we have several different data sets of global surface temperature. The Met Office produced one, NOAA in the States produced one, NASA. But there's actually quite a lot of commonality. And the problem was that all of the data sets showed this same cold feature. And one of the ways that, because there's so many different things going on, one of the ways that we try and we look at the uncertainty in the data set is how people that have made different choices in constructing their data sets, how different they are. And what Sebastian's study really showed was that we can have agreement and they can all be wrong. So the fact that we were comforted by the fact that all these data sets showed the same thing meant that didn't count for very much if they were all missing the same problem. So people are now trying, everyone's trying to understand this, and one of the ways that people are trying to remove this cold bias is actually by sort of pinning the marine temperatures to land temperatures, because that was one of the reasons we saw that the problem became very clear, was that the land temperatures were not affected. But the problem is, if you do that, then you sort of lose the independence, so you can't start looking at differences between the land and the ocean and use that to understand our changing climate. So what we really want to do is to be able to fix the ocean temperatures and then look at the agreement with the land temperatures. So yes, so while we do have data sets that are now pinning the sea surface temperatures to the land air temperatures, really what we want to do is to fix and understand the ocean temperatures. So there's going to be a new generation of data sets coming out, and then there'll be a lot of work comparing those with the output of climate models, and those will feed into the next IPCC. So the structural uncertainty is really important, and it was really showing that we don't have enough diversity, we don't have enough different groups looking at this, because it's a massive problem going from, all those things that I've talked about, and then you have to combine them, either using different statistical methods to infill and smooth and generate fields, and do that for the land and the ocean. And it's kind of these are massive tasks, and they're typically done by the Met Office, NOAA, NASA. It needs big organisations. The Japan Meteorological Agency. I mean, not many people do this. No. And one of the things we're really trying to do is to sort of break this apart so that people can take a look at smaller parts of it, because if you need to do the whole thing to produce a data set, there's very few people who can actually, or very few organisations who could do that. But there's if you can pick out a small problem and say maybe somebody could help with the ship tracking, maybe somebody can look at the biases, and maybe somebody really wants to look at the statistical techniques we use to put the data together. And if we can manage to sort of break these sort of big systems apart and make them sort of more modular, we should be able to get more people involved, and fix these problems, in a sort of community way, rather than saying, well, go on then, fix it, because that's what's happening at the moment. And it sort of happens on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We get reports every 6 or 7 years, and we tend to get new data sets on those cycles, because obviously people are, that makes sense to sort of drive improvements in the data sets on those cycles. But it'd be great if we can do that more quickly, so that people can use the best knowledge we have, rather than wait for another 6 or 7 years for somebody to go and fix it. So what we really want to do is sort of drive improvements more quickly.
Absolutely. So all hands on deck then, ideally.
Absolutely.
Well, as I said, good luck with all of that. Closing question then, just thinking about kind of the future. I mean, we've obviously we're incorporating new kind of technologies all the time now in measuring our sea surface temperatures. How do you see that progressing in the near future?
Well, we know the sea surface temperature now better than we ever have. We have satellites, so very high resolution. It's important that we get slightly different types of measurements, because they're obviously looking at the very top sort of few molecules of the ocean. So there's work to be done to try and relate those measurements to measurements, the traditional measurements that we get a bit deeper, either from ships or buoys. But one thing I should say, going back to the historical record, is that because we have these new measurements to look at the variability, for example, that really helps us understand the older observations, because before we didn't really, you only have the observations themselves. But now, looking at the satellite data and the data from drifters and moored buoys and the modern ships, we have, quite detailed information. So we could start using the information on variability to really constrain, the patterns we expect to see and how fast we expect to see changes and things like that. So we absolutely need the modern record. That's, and the patterns are beautiful as well. So, that's, one thing. It would be fantastic to be able to produce, older records with that, that beautiful structure you see, rather than the sort of blocky things we get now. So, I think that's really, looking at everything, looking at the modern and the historical record together is really, really how we're going to make progress, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, with that, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the podcast. To ensure you don't miss out on future episodes, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.